Which means it is just not a matter of, theatre commands. It is about putting the nation's, it's all the levers of statecraft coming together with one purpose, that is to, prevail in the strategic military competition, ensure deterrence, and if you have to fight to win those wars. So I'm saying the fundamental argument is, what is the purpose of theatre commands? It is simply the modern way of fighting wars.
You require that orchestration, that you require that, that master puppeteer who can make sure that, you sequence and phase the application of these vectors in such a manner that your effects are not the summation of these two, but there's a multiplier to it.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. So, good afternoon everyone and welcome to the next episode of Dabble in Dialogues. I'm delighted to have as my guest today none other than Lt Gen Raj Shukla, a coursemate, a close friend, colleague and a rock star, I would say in many ways.
I've been urging Monty to leave his narrow maritime domain for long. He's finally agreed to do an interview with a Pongo.
So I thought while we've been focusing on maritime, but we'll come to something, we'll elevate ourselves into something that has got, I would say, tri-service implications, including the maritime domain. And today I thought we'll talk about restructuring. One argument, of course, is that that restructuring and theaterization, so to speak, is critical for us. There are views against, there are views for, there are views for the model, etc. So Raj, before I thought I'll seek your broad sort of views on the requirement for restructuring.
So Monty, I've been clear for years now. See, there are two stories in India. One is to continue with these silos, and they may have a viewpoint. So a silo of air power, a silo of land power, a silo of the maritime domain, and there is that other story of cross-pollination, or even before that, integration, cross-pollination and fusion. So it's actually a larger concept. You can argue it anyway. I am a strong believer in the latter, which means it is just not a matter of, theatre commands. It is about putting the nation's, it's all the levers of statecraft coming together with one purpose, that is to, prevail in the strategic military competition, ensure deterrence, and if you have to fight to win those wars. So I'm saying the fundamental argument is, what is the purpose of theatre commands? It is simply the modern way of fighting wars. And we can go into the details of this, why I say so. And if I may make, Monty, just one point. Look at the CDS. Just by appointing the CDS, you have seen this time integrated evolution of options. I have seen it here as a brigadier and then a colonel. For 1 month we would go on about single service options. Army ये करेगी, Navy ये करेगी, फिर उसको हम integrate करेंगे. Just this should tell us that this is the first step in this whole ladder. And what is most worrying is, I'm the first one to concede that this war was won by the Air Force. Air Force and AD played a great role. So I'm a big votary of air power, but in an integrated framework and not in a siloed framework. But what is happening, Monty, is that I can already see voices. The Air Force has done well, so no theatre commands. That would be exactly retrograde.
So I fully agree with you, because ultimately, if you want, you need that multiplier effect of orchestration. If you have multiple vectors, as you've said, I'm talking about, so there's some vectors that go beyond the military domain. If you're talking about the economic vector, if you're talking about, so those are way beyond it. But even in the military domain, if you're talking about, land, sea, air, are the three traditional, and I would say the others being cyberspace and possibly information warfare. So you're talking about these 6 vectors. You require that orchestration, that you require that, that master puppeteer who can make sure that, you sequence and phase the application of these vectors in such a manner that your effects are not the summation of these two, but there's a multiplier to it.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. So in that sense, it's critical. But of course, there are naysayers in all this, and one of the naysayers.
So what are the arguments of the naysayers? Let's deal with them.
Yeah. So one of the naysayer arguments, of course, is, let's start with, there are many, is that change is always disruptive, and therefore, because of the complications that we have right now in both our borders, with our northern and on our western borders, this is not the time to undergo this turbulence in which your combat power might probably be, I wouldn't say decline, but there might be some turbulence, and we cannot accept that risk of turbulence at a time when we have unsettled borders. So what is the argument regarding that?
So which is that period when our adversaries will say, here we'll do nothing, take your 5 years and reform? I mean, what kind of argument is this?
Yeah.
So the most serious response to this is that, see, our responses must not be episodic.
Yeah.
कि भाई सिंदूर हुआ तो अब reform करो. We have to build these enduring capacities.
Yeah.
And see, the difference between us and China is this. They are building in enduring capacities which come out of conviction of, integrating, of getting these new capacities going. So I mean, if this is the basic argument of the naysayer, it is utterly brittle. What do I say? Utterly brittle.
But there are many others also, and I would say some.
So let's grapple with all of them.
Yeah. So another argument that comes out in terms of naysayers is that in any reform, that the services themselves are more or less have got their act together, and we've got a CDS in place, etc. What's not so much required is reform within the Ministry of Defence and the 6 vectors that we define, but in the terms of national security at its higher level. That's where the ultimate reforms, etc., are required. So what about that?
So see, this is so this is a good point we must deal with. So I look at it this way, that as the Indian state evolved and grew, it grew on one fundamental assumption, which was that we will be defensive, we will secure our external environment, create a benign internal environment so that we can focus on the growth and prosperity of 143 crore people. Made sense, eminent sense. Except, Monty, that is not the reality. Every 5 to 10 years we are faced with a great crisis, confrontation or conflict. So India has to plot its rise in a turbulent world. It has to grow in the face of multiple crises and confrontation, which means that the instrument of force will be central to our growth, in the sense that unless we use the instrument of force, or we learn to use the instrument of force periodically, our economy will not grow. And I think the fundamental lesson of Sindoor is this: we have rediscovered the utility of force. Now, in our growth beyond, and we are in a phase, I think it's a very delicate phase, when there is this aspiring Vishwabandhu plotting its rise in a battle between a contested hegemon USA and a rising challenger China. We have to plot our rise. Now, there are many factors, economic, diplomacy, so on and so forth. But given the reality of our strategic environment, the instrument of force will be central. So I'm saying that you cannot grow unless you nourish your instrument of force and keep it in the highest states of readiness. And one of the factors so the argument is lethality and readiness. And you cannot be lethal, you cannot be ready unless you carry out structural reforms like theatre commands, cultural corrections like this whole IFA system, startups, and so on. So everybody needs to reform. Now the great danger of the first argument that you gave of the naysayers is this: all right, so if we don't need theatre commands, then we don't need DRDO reform, then we don't need Agniveer. All reforms will roll back on these reasons. So this is where now India's larger sagacity is being called. Can we all rise above our narrow outlooks and opinions to see everybody needs to reform? Not, I can tell you now today that DRDO will say, look, Akash Tir has done so well, we don't need to reform. Akash Tir may have done well with the Pakistanis, it will be thoroughly inadequate against the Chinese. So we have to see how we need to go beyond.
So the other issue that that comes to my mind is that there's another argument that goes that really when you look at the theaterization model, it is primarily an expeditionary model. It's required for distant theatres and all that. And here, where India is primarily a single theatre, the present structures are well equipped, and as a corollary to that is that that we do not have the adequate number of resources to distribute what is commonly used in penny packets is the term that is commonly used that amongst theatre commands, and therefore it's better that this resource is centrally controlled, and we continue in many ways following our present structure where you put the CDS and the organization in place, and you need not have separate theatres looking at separate sort of threats in moving ahead. So what would you say about that?
So the fundamental premise that theatre commands are only for expeditionary reasons is flawed. It is simply the modern way of fighting wars. For example, you need one commander who can deal with the western horizons. Now what does he need to do? And there's a very good example. He needs to look not only at Pakistan, he needs to look at what Turkey is doing. He needs to look beyond into Afghanistan, into West Asia. So the theatre commander will have a quasi-diplomatic role, quasi-diplomatic. Just like the Chinese theatre commander, the Western theatre commander looks at BRI. He looks at how you are going to connect to Europe. Now to even acknowledge that, concede that, people from the diplomatic domain will have a problem. Because you are now elevating your theatre command to a new role. So these arguments are entirely flawed. Is the Western theatre command, does it have an expeditionary role? No, it is looking at India. The Eastern theatre command of the Chinese is looking at Taiwan. But there is nothing expeditionary about it. But I'll tell you where the expeditionary argument comes now. If we are to project power, the serious call that theatre commanders and the Indian strategic ecosystem will have to take is that do we need to invest resources in getting POK or projecting power across Malacca? I would say projecting power across Malacca. So there, you may call it expeditionary. No, it is as India grows in its powerhood. We should. This is not a military to jackboot around the world, but a military which can be employed, technologically enabled, calibrated, which you can use to protect your interest, be that along the western border or beyond Malacca. It's a whole outlook and attitude.
In fact, I would even go beyond and make an argument in favor of what you're mentioning. Is this issue regarding distributing assets in penny packets? It's not true at all, because anyway your assets will have to be distributed in various parts of geography. But the Chiefs of Staff Committee, which is headed by the CDS, one of their fundamental tasks is allocation of force. So wherever the threat arises, you're going to pick up the forces from wherever they are and allocate it to a commander for employment.
And let me get more specific. If it was a problem of assets, then why does the Air Force have a command to match the army everywhere if you didn't have assets? So that is not an argument. You have those commands, you must give them assets, but fundamentally that argument is not true. The assets can be moved around, and I'm telling you after Sindoor, we will get those assets. So I'm saying you need air power, you need stealth-enabled defensive air power. So the Air Force will grow, but in what manner? This Air Force which grows has to be 50% piloted platforms, 50% unmanned platforms. Now this whole theatre command, jointmanship argument is for the CDS to enforce this. Left to the Air Force, they will choose piloted platforms. It applies to the Army too. So, in that sense, it is not directly, or let me say, the structural correction has got nothing to do with assets. It is just the modern way of fighting wars. Ultimately, it means that a tank commander should be able to call for fire of the F-16 with minimum bureaucracies.
So I fully agree with you that, I see air power as fundamental to future conflict.
Yes, I acknowledge that.
So no one is debating that. Now whether that air power, is going to be manned or unmanned, or whether you're going to use, I would say, missiles for delivery of those strike capability, etc. I mean, it's all fundamentally, and you're using the air environment for delivery of ordnance. So how it's going to come, whether it's going to be, from unmanned platforms, manned, or whether it's going to be from more offensive platforms like rocket force equivalent. So that's very much said and done. Sometimes also the argument is a historical argument that says, that hitherto we've done quite well. If you see in 71, if you see our recent conflicts, if you see it now. So, sometimes a little bit of foot dragging, because if you performed reasonably well or exceptionally well in certain cases, in the past, then the tendency is, of course, that why go through the pain of reform? That's another issue that has to be contended from time to time.
So many American companies and defense primes did very well in the 80s and 90s. Because they refused to reform, what did startups do to them? So do we want to go the way of those American companies?
Kodak being one of them, which you can just say that, they were the inventors of digital photography, and they went down, because they didn't adopt it.
They didn't reform.
Yeah.
So a wise organization, even when it does well, does double the reforms.
Yeah.
And
you have to be ahead of the curve at all times.
Yes. And if I may make just one more argument, this thought crosses my mind. Yeah. See, today I am told, one has heard this, the theatre commands that will come, you will have one army, one air force, one navy, and perhaps the CISC, if it gets done, it will be 2-1-1. I'm saying we must come to a time when out of the 4, there could be 3 air force, 1 army. There could be 1 army.
So it should be service agnostic, really.
It should be merit, absolute merit. Yeah. And the Americans have come to it. When it evolves, for example, in Iraq and Afghanistan, the boss of the CENTCOM, when they were primarily land battles, was not an army man, but Admiral Mike Mullen, and there was not a murmur.
I think it was Admiral Blair, if I'm not mistaken.
Blair, yes. Blair was here in IPACOM. I'm talking of CENTCOM. So, when the land wars were being fought in Iraq and Afghanistan. So, ultimately, because these people have gone through the joint grind, they understand how land forces are applied and those forces are. So this is a choice we need to make.
So you think we have to invest a lot? Finally your commands are going to be manned by people.
Yes.
And so the people have to have a joint outlook. They have to have, I would say, a greater understanding of how the other services operate. Is this, you think there has to be a time lag between designing a structure and having the manpower that can adequately man that structure, or should we bite the bullet and just do it, and the manpower will sort of meet that requirement in due course?
From what I gather, the CDS has been working on it. He's got a model.
Yeah.
Now you can debate the model and implement it.
Yeah.
How long will we debate now, Monty? We've gone on debating this for 70 years. When I was a colonel in the HDMC, I recall we made the first presentation on this, CDS and theatre commands. The time has come now simply to just go ahead and implement. How long will we drag our feet?
And I would also say in this respect that nothing is written in stone.
Nothing is written in stone.
So if you make certain errors, if you have to make certain course corrections, you can make them by and by. So there's nothing that, and obviously you're not going to get it perfect in the first iteration. It will have to evolve, and circumstances are changing, so you'll have to keep pace with that.
I have 2 suggestions to make. One is I've been suggesting to the CDS for long. The CDS must sit on the boards of 3 stars. If he sits on the boards of 3 stars, the whole language, the culture will become joint. If he does not sit on the board of 3 stars, these single service, inclinations will grow. And the second issue is, I have no doubt, ultimately it will become a merit-based system. An army Lieutenant General will choose a naval 3-star as his deputy for reasons of competence and fairness. And that is the ultimate
because at the end of the day, if you're given charge of a certain theatre, your ultimate requirement is to be victorious in battle.
Yes, absolutely.
And you're going to spare no effort that not only do you have the right wherewithal, but I would say you have the right people to implement your plans, etc., to make sure that you produce a desired effects. One more big advantage, if you ask me, that theaterization will bring is in allocation of resource.
Yes.
Because what happens right now, it's very difficult for anyone sitting in a headquarters when you're operating in a slightly siloed mode to make this determination what is more important for you. Whether it's an aircraft carrier, or whether it's a 5th generation fighter, or whether it's a new tank system that you want to introduce. How do you, if resources were abundant, you can say all of the above. If resources are scarce, you have to prioritize. And it's ideal if this prioritization emerges from the person who's going to use it in combat. And I think any theatre commander, the first thing he will shed in this respect is the color of his uniform, because finally he wants to emerge victorious at the end.
So, you raise a very valid point. Now, I have 2 points to make here. One is, of course, is what you are saying. And see, in the current predicament, what happens? It is a satisfying solution. So 36 attack hectares, अच्छा आर्मी ने नाराज हो जाए तो 12, Air Force ने नाराज हो जाए तो 12. What is this kind of stuff? It doesn't sell with your colonels here. What is this argument? And the second issue is, and now here I must introduce a note of caution. I am of this view that even as we get joint, as we get integrated, the service chiefs must not be marginalized. The UK made this great mistake when they pushed the service chiefs out of any decision making. That would not be the right way. So the Chiefs of Staff Committee, the service chiefs must continue to have heft in terms of, for example, there is a certain maritimity, air-mindedness, land power-ness which needs to be retained. If I'm an Air Force CDS, I must not get the hubris to start interfering in land operations. So the professionalism of each service. Now that is an art. A wise CDS will know where to draw a line. So I'm all for jointness, but yet mature people who know not to interfere beyond a point. That finessing will have to be done, and a good model is where the British went wrong in overly empowering the CDS, and which led to a lot of problems in Iraq and Afghanistan. That fine balance will have to be struck. And one more issue. See, the moment you get a CDS or this jointness growing, my view today is that the first two commands which must be upgraded not by rank but in terms of combat status is space and cyber. Your fundamental capacities for all the services coming from space as a war-fighting domain. As long as you continue with this other model, space will never get nourished. Cyber similarly. Cyber today you are getting exploits which will paralyze cities. And they are fundamental attributes in the US inventory, in the Chinese inventory. That's what creates deterrence. Look at AI. The Americans have identified two commands. Hexeth has signed an order. Eurocom, IPACOM, agents, Endural, LLMs, Microsoft. We need to get going now. So theatre commands is just one argument. We need to go beyond it. So there is a lot to be done, but in the spirit of integration, jointness, let me make one more point. Cross-pollination. Has not the time come for the MOD to be cross-pollinated? Why not people like, say, Raja Mohan, I'm just giving names, you please choose yours, say Kalyani or somebody like that, who are there formally in the MOD, who give you better advice, the commercial stuff that you need, what you need for startups, technology. When will all this happen? This just has to happen.
And of course, I would say, one of the other counter arguments which I find a little weak really is that we are integrated because we have enduring friendship with each other, we've been course mates, we've known each other. I pick up the phone and speak, and therefore, whatever requirements. Of course, all that works, and undoubtedly, if you ask me, that interpersonal relationships forms an important part of people functioning together. But if you ask me, that is the grease, it's not the gear wheel. Your gear wheel has to be structure. Structure is imperative. In the breakdown of interpersonal relationships, you cannot say that jointmanship will not happen. So I think that
respectfully, Monty, that's a puerile piece of argument. We're having a good podcast. We'll step out of the podcast. Over aircraft carriers, we may come to blows. So all this business of hunters caught on, I've heard this for very long. It's not serious stuff. And I'm telling you why. These arguments should not be peddled because the middle piece and younger officers are bright people. They don't buy into these stuff. In fact, I have no evidence, but you do a survey, you will find the resistance to jointmanship and all these evolutionary things comes more from the top brass, not from the middle piece, who are surprisingly clairvoyant. Very clairvoyant. So, and we have to brace up to these realities.
So I think we've covered a lot of ground, Raj, and anything you would like to say in sort of summing up the discussion that we've had today?
Nobody to sum up, but I just like to say one thing, Monty, that Ops Sindoor should tell us that national security is a very important domain in our strategic calculus. we have to be very cognizant about it and act in a very competent manner, because geopolitics is extremely unforgiving of those that are either negligent, contemptuous or incompetent towards national security.
Yeah.
And I'm one of those who of late has been thinking that if there is one country which has grimmer challenges than Israel, it is India. No, we just saw Pakistan. Look at our northern borders where the military component to the power differential is $450 billion. Bangladesh is a national security reality. And I'm an army man who's been saying for long, look at the seas. We just have to find the money for that 400 ship navy of the Chinese. And so this India is, at a national security crossroad. We really have to see very seriously how we nourish our instrument of force, because if we do not do it adequately, culturally, structurally, in thought and action, we may be in for serious trouble.
So while I agree with you, and I agree with maybe the long-term requirement of certainly, or not necessarily long-term, but even in the medium and short term, of seeking additional funding. But if you ask me, restructuring and structural reform is combat power for free, if you ask me.
Yes.
So that is just within the resources that you have. If you can apply it in a coherent manner, this is you're attaining a multiplier for which you're not even expending resources. You're just expending time in putting a reform process in place, which will give you much better results in years.
All structural reforms, but also spending more. And why we need to spend more, we can do on another podcast.
Right. So thanks again, Raj. Really delighted to have you here, and look forward to many such discussions in the future.
Thank you, Monty. Great pleasure. And all the best to your podcast. May it become the nation's #1 podcast sometime in the future.